The grand ballroom of Mar-a-Lago buzzed with the energy of an exclusive gathering. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors as guests in designer suits and elegant gowns mingled beneath gold-framed portraits. The evening was meant to celebrate a successful business deal, but tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Donald Trump Jr. moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, and his smile carried the weight of inherited authority. He had been planning this moment for weeks, knowing that tonight would be different from all the other social gatherings at his father's estate. Near the main entrance stood Captain Marcus Wellington, a decorated member of the Royal Guard who had been assigned to provide security for a visiting dignitary. His red uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his bearing spoke of years of disciplined service to the crown. He had protected royalty across 3 continents and had never once compromised his duty. The captain's presence had been irritating Don Jr. all evening. Something about the way the guard carried himself, the respect he commanded from other guests, and the quiet authority in his eyes rubbed against Don Jr.'s sense of supremacy in his own territory. This was his family's domain, and he wasn't used to sharing the spotlight with anyone, especially not some foreign security officer. As the evening progressed, Don Jr.'s irritation grew into something more dangerous. He watched as guests approached, the captain with genuine respect, asking about his service and commenting on his impressive bearing. The attention that should have been focused on him was being diverted to this outsider in a fancy uniform. The tipping point came when Don Jr. overheard a prominent businessman praising the captain's professionalism to a group of investors. The man spoke about how refreshing it was to see someone who took their responsibilities seriously, someone who understood the meaning of true service. The words stung Don Jr. like a personal insult. He began formulating a plan, his mind racing, with the possibilities of asserting his dominance. He had the home field advantage, the family name and the power that came with both. Surely he could handle one foreign guard who had forgotten his place in the hierarchy of this particular evening. The music from the string quartet seemed to grow louder as Don Jr. made his decision. He would show everyone present exactly who held the real power in this room. The captain's composure and quiet confidence would be tested in ways he had never experienced before. Don Jr. straightened his tie and checked his watch. The evening was young, and he had all the time in the world to make his point. He moved through the crowd with renewed purpose, his eyes fixed on the red-uniformed figure who had unknowingly challenged his authority simply by existing in the same space. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered by everyone present, though not in the way Don Jr. expected. The captain continued his professional vigil, unaware that he was about to become the center of a drama that would reveal the true character of both men involved. Don Jr. approached his personal security team with the swagger of someone accustomed to having his every whim fulfilled. The 3 men in black suits had been with the family for years, and they knew better than to question direct orders from any member of the Trump family. Their loyalty was absolute, bought and paid for with generous salaries and the promise of continued employment. "Gentlemen," Don Jr. said, his voice carrying the tone of casual authority he had perfected over decades of privilege. "I need you to handle a small situation for me. That guard over there," he nodded toward Captain Wellington, "is making our guests uncomfortable with his intimidating presence. I want him removed from the premises immediately." The lead security officer, a former police detective named Rodriguez, glanced toward the captain and then back at his employer. He had worked enough high-profile events to recognize professional security when he saw it, and the Royal Guard's conduct had been nothing but exemplary throughout the evening. But Rodriguez also knew which side of his paycheck was buttered. "Understood, sir," Rodriguez replied, though something in his tone suggested reluctance. "How would you like us to handle the approach?" Don Jr.'s smile grew wider, revealing a satisfaction that came from knowing he was about to assert his dominance. "I don't care about the details. Just make it clear that his services are no longer needed here. Be firm about it. This is private property, and we decide who stays and who goes." The security team exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between men who had worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. They had handled difficult situations before, but something about this particular order felt different. The captain hadn't caused any disturbance, hadn't even spoken to most of the guests beyond polite acknowledgments. As they prepared to approach Captain Wellington, other guests began to notice the movement. Conversations quieted slightly, and several people turned their attention toward what appeared to be developing into an interesting confrontation. The captain himself remained focused on his duties, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot potential threats before they materialized. Don Jr. positioned himself where he could watch the interaction unfold, his anticipation barely contained. He had orchestrated this moment carefully, choosing the perfect time when the maximum number of influential guests would witness his display of power. In his mind, this was about much more than removing one security guard. It was about establishing hierarchy and demonstrating that even foreign officials answered to the Trump family name. The captain noticed the approaching security team before they were halfway across the room. His training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation with the calm efficiency that had kept him alive through numerous dangerous assignments. 3 men moving with purpose toward him could mean many things, but their body language suggested they weren't coming to ask about the weather. Rodriguez stepped forward first, clearing his throat to get the captain's attention. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to need to ask you to leave the premises." The request hung in the air like a challenge, and Captain Wellington turned his full attention to the security team. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with the focus of someone who had faced down much more dangerous opponents than 3 private security guards in expensive suits. The room seemed to hold its breath as guests realized they were about to witness something far more interesting than typical party conversation. Don Jr. watched from his vantage point, confident that his authority was about to be demonstrated in the most public way possible. Captain Wellington studied the 3 men before him with the calm assessment of someone who had faced hostile forces in war zones. His posture remained perfectly erect, hands clasped behind his back in the traditional at-ease position. But every muscle in his body was ready for whatever might come next. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I believe there's been some misunderstanding," the captain replied, his British accent crisp and clear enough for nearby guests to hear every word. "I'm here in an official capacity providing security for Ambassador Hartford as requested by your State Department. I have proper credentials and authorization." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, realizing that this situation was more complex than his employer had led him to believe. "Sir, we understand your position, but this is private property, and the owner's son has requested that you leave immediately." The captain's eyes moved past the security team to settle on Don Jr., who was watching the confrontation with obvious satisfaction. In that moment, Wellington understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about security concerns or protocol violations. This was about ego and the abuse of power by someone who had never learned the difference between authority and bullying. "I see," Wellington said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had served under actual fire rather than hiding behind family connections. "And does the owner's son understand the diplomatic implications of forcibly removing foreign security personnel who are here at his government's invitation?" The question hit the security team like a bucket of cold water. They were private contractors, not federal agents, and international incidents were far above their pay grade. Rodriguez looked back toward Don Jr., hoping for clearer guidance, but found only an expectant stare that demanded results regardless of consequences. Guests around the room had stopped pretending to engage in other conversations. The tension was palpable, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something that could have repercussions far beyond this single evening. Several people discreetly pulled out their phones, sensing that whatever happened next would be worth documenting. Don Jr. realized that his carefully planned demonstration of power wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he had anticipated. The captain's calm professionalism and pointed questions about diplomatic protocol were making his security team hesitate, and the growing audience was watching with more curiosity than admiration. He decided to take matters into his own hands, striding across the room with the confidence of someone who believed his family name was more powerful than any foreign credentials. "Captain," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the ballroom, "I think there's been enough discussion. This is my family's property and I'm telling you to leave." Wellington turned to face Don Jr. directly, and for the first time that evening, his expression shifted slightly. Not with anger or fear, but with the kind of quiet disappointment reserved for watching someone reveal their true character in the most unflattering way possible. "Mr. Trump," the captain said, his voice remaining steady and respectful despite the circumstances, "I understand this is your family's property. However, I'm here performing duties assigned to me by Her Majesty's government in coordination with your State Department. Perhaps you should speak with Ambassador Hartford about your concerns." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Don Jr. realized that he had painted himself into a corner. Backing down now would make him look weak in front of all these important guests, but pushing forward risked creating the kind of international incident that even his family's influence might not be able to smooth over. The captain waited patiently for a response, his bearing unchanged, while everyone in the room held their breath for what would come next. Don Jr.'s face flushed red as he realized the captain's suggestion would require him to admit he hadn't consulted with the ambassador before making his demands. The diplomatic protocol the captain mentioned was real, and everyone in the room with any international business experience knew it. But backing down now felt impossible with so many eyes watching his every move. "I don't need to speak with anyone," Don Jr. snapped, his voice rising above the conversational murmur of the crowd. "This is America, not England, and you're on Trump property. When I tell you to leave, you leave. It's that simple." The captain's expression didn't change, but several guests nearby winced at the crude display of power. These were sophisticated people who understood nuance and diplomacy, and Don Jr.'s approach was making them uncomfortable. Ambassador Hartford, who had been engaged in conversation across the room, began making his way toward the confrontation with obvious concern. "Sir," Captain Wellington replied, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child, "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. International security arrangements require—" "I don't care about your arrangements," Don Jr. interrupted, stepping closer to the captain with aggressive body language that made his security team tense. "You're going to leave now, or my men are going to make you leave. Your choice." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the entire ballroom fell silent. Even the string quartet stopped playing, sensing that something serious was developing. Phones appeared in more hands as guests realized they were witnessing a potential international incident unfold in real time. Captain Wellington looked at Don Jr. for a long moment, then at the security team, then back at the man who was trying to humiliate him in front of a room full of strangers. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced down actual enemies rather than spoiled rich kids throwing tantrums. "Mr. Trump," the captain said, his words measured and clear, "I've served my queen and country in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Bosnia. I've been shot at by terrorists, threatened by warlords, and faced down armed insurgents who wanted to kill me and everyone I was protecting. I've never once abandoned my post or failed in my duty." The captain paused, letting his words sink in while Don Jr.'s face grew even redder with anger and embarrassment. The guests around them leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "So if you think," Wellington continued, his voice gaining steel while remaining perfectly controlled, "that you and your rent-a-cops are going to intimidate me into abandoning my responsibility to Ambassador Hartford, you're about to learn why the Royal Guard has protected the crown for over 300 years. The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Several guests audibly gasped, while others pulled out their phones to record what was clearly about to become either a legendary moment or a complete disaster. Don Jr. stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as he realized that his attempt to publicly humiliate the captain had backfired spectacularly. Rodriguez and his team exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very aware that they were private security guards being asked to physically confront a highly trained military professional who had just made it clear he wouldn't be going anywhere quietly. The simple eviction Don Jr. had ordered was rapidly evolving into something none of them were prepared to handle. Ambassador Hartford finally reached the group, his diplomatic training evident in his calm but authoritative presence. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "perhaps we should discuss this situation privately rather than providing entertainment for the entire party." Ambassador Hartford's arrival should have provided Don Jr. with an escape route, but his wounded pride and the audience of influential guests made retreat feel impossible. Instead of accepting the diplomatic lifeline, he doubled down on his aggressive stance, turning to face the ambassador with barely contained fury. "Ambassador, your guard here seems to have forgotten where he is," Don Jr. said, his voice carrying the petulant tone of someone unused to being challenged. "I've asked him politely to leave, and he's being deliberately disrespectful to me and my family." The ambassador's eyes moved between Don Jr. and Captain Wellington, quickly assessing the situation with the skill of someone who had spent decades navigating international tensions. He could see the barely controlled anger in Don Jr.'s face, the professional calm of his security officer, and the excited anticipation of the watching crowd. "Captain Wellington," the ambassador said carefully, "perhaps you could explain the situation from your perspective." But before the captain could respond, Don Jr. exploded with frustration. "There's nothing to explain. This is my property and I want him gone. If he won't leave voluntarily, then I'll have him thrown out." The threat crystallized everything that had been building throughout the evening. Captain Wellington straightened to his full height, which was considerable, and fixed Don Jr. with a stare that had made hardened soldiers reconsider their life choices. "Mr. Trump," the captain said, his voice cutting through the ballroom like a blade, "you seem to be under the impression that your family name gives you the authority to override international law and diplomatic protocol. Allow me to correct that misunderstanding." The captain took a single step forward, not aggressive but unmistakably confident. "I am Captain Marcus Wellington of Her Majesty's Royal Guard. I have served in the Household Division for 15 years. I have protected members of the royal family, foreign dignitaries, and heads of state. I have been awarded the Military Cross for valor under fire." Another step forward, and Don Jr. instinctively stepped back, his bravado beginning to crack under the weight of the captain's presence. "You, sir," Wellington continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire room, "are the son of a businessman who inherited his wealth and thinks that money can buy respect. You've never served anything greater than your own ego, never protected anyone but your own interests, and never faced a real challenge in your privileged life." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Guests stood transfixed, watching a master class in controlled power delivered with surgical precision. Don Jr.'s face had gone from red to pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he struggled to process being dressed down so thoroughly in front of his peers. But Captain Wellington wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a level that somehow made his words even more powerful. "So when you threaten to have your hired help throw me out, remember this. I've been thrown better punches by people far more dangerous than you'll ever be. The difference is they were brave enough to try it themselves instead of hiding behind other men's courage." The captain straightened, returning to his professional bearing, but the damage was done. Don Jr. stood exposed before the entire gathering. His attempt at dominance turned into a humiliating lesson about the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. Rodriguez and his security team remained motionless, none of them eager to test the captain's claim about handling physical confrontations. The threat that had seemed so simple when Don Jr. first issued it now looked like potential career suicide. The aftermath of Captain Wellington's response rippled through the ballroom like shockwaves from an explosion. Don Jr. stood frozen, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as he processed the complete demolition of his authority in front of the most important social gathering of the season. Ambassador Hartford stepped smoothly into the silence, his diplomatic training allowing him to navigate the wreckage of the confrontation. "Captain, perhaps you could resume your position by the entrance. I believe the immediate situation has been clarified." Wellington nodded crisply to the ambassador, then turned back to Don Jr. one final time. "Mr. Trump," he said with formal politeness, "I'll be here for the remainder of the evening, performing my assigned duties. I trust we won't have any further misunderstandings about my presence." Without waiting for a response, the captain executed a perfect about-face and returned to his post near the main entrance, his bearing unchanged despite having just delivered one of the most devastating verbal takedowns in Mar-a-Lago history. The guests slowly began to resume their conversations, but the energy in the room had completely shifted. Small groups formed quickly, voices low but animated as people processed what they had just witnessed. Several prominent businessmen looked at Don Jr. with barely concealed disappointment, while others simply avoided eye contact altogether. Don Jr.'s security team dispersed without further instructions, Rodriguez catching his employer's eye briefly before melting back into the crowd. The unspoken message was clear. They were security guards, not miracle workers, and they had no intention of testing their luck against a decorated combat veteran who had just proved he could destroy reputations with words alone. The social media implications became apparent within minutes as phones buzzed with messages and discreet photos taken during the confrontation began circulating among the guest list. By morning, the story would be spreading through international diplomatic circles, with Captain Wellington's response being quoted and analyzed by foreign policy experts who understood exactly what had transpired. Don Jr. attempted to salvage the situation by engaging in forced conversations with nearby guests, but his usual confidence was shattered. Every interaction felt strained, every laugh seemed hollow, and he could sense the shift in how people were responding to him. The power he had tried to demonstrate had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of public humiliation. Ambassador Hartford approached Captain Wellington at his post later in the evening, speaking quietly. "That was comprehensive, Captain." "Sir," Wellington replied with characteristic understatement, "I felt it was important to clarify certain misunderstandings about military service and professional responsibility." The ambassador smiled slightly. "Indeed. I suspect Mr. Trump won't forget tonight's lesson anytime soon." As the evening wound down, guests began departing with far more interesting stories to tell than they had anticipated. The confrontation would be remembered and retold for years, becoming part of Washington's social mythology about the dangers of confusing wealth with wisdom and privilege with power. Captain Wellington remained at his post until the last guest departed, his duty fulfilled exactly as he had promised. Don Jr.'s attempt to publicly humiliate a foreign security officer had instead become a masterclass in dignity under pressure and the difference between real authority and inherited arrogance. The final image of the evening was Don Jr. watching from a window as Captain Wellington escorted Ambassador Hartford to their official vehicle, the guards bearing as perfect in departure as it had been throughout the entire confrontation. The lesson was complete, and everyone present understood exactly who had emerged victorious from the battle of wills that had defined the most memorable social gathering in recent memory.